All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us at the first ever Professor's Debate on Consciousness. We are so excited to host you. I am your host at USC. My name is Celine, and I am a recent graduate from USC Dornsife's Neuroscience and Psychology program. I am also currently the president and founder of Children Debate Union, an American parliamentary debate team built under our law school. On the screen here is Jasenia, our host at University of Chicago.
Okay, I'll just make a quick confirmation. Can everyone at USC hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right on.
Can everyone at UChicago hear me? Okay, that's wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasenia. I'm a member of the Chicago Debate Society, and I'm vice president of outreach. So I'm very happy to have you all here because the Chicago Debate Society does a few things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do. We debate. And it's wonderful because we not only compete in debate, but we host public debates like this to kind of get engagement across the campus and get people more involved with like discussions about different topics. We also hold lectures and we talk about different things like philosophy and such in our debate lectures. So I would consider coming to a meeting if you guys would like to, and come to me for any additional information. We travel a lot and we do a lot of fun things. So I think it's a great club to join. Otherwise, we're really excited to be hosting this public debate with these professors because they're really, really great. And yeah, we're going to pass it off to the professors to introduce themselves and get into the debate. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Kaplan is going to begin by introducing himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonas Kaplan. I'm a professor here at USC in the psychology department and here in the Brain and Creativity Institute, where we are now sitting. I'm also the co-director of the Dornsife Neuroimaging Institute. You might not know if you've not been in this building, but right across the hall from here is our functional MRI scanner where we do brain imaging research. And so I'm so happy to be here with you all. I'm honored to be debating this issue with Professor Callard, and it's so great to see such an awesome turnout on both sides of the country. Professor Callard.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Ben Callard. I'm here in the philosophy department at UChicago. I've been here for 15 years. We're here in the Classics building. I don't know why it's called the Classics, why it's called Classics 110, but no doubt there's some reason. I'm interested in most areas of philosophy, but maybe particularly philosophy of mind. So I'm very, very much looking forward to this debate or conversation with Professor Kaplan. And I also like to thank the Chicago Debate Society and the Trojan Debate Union for creating and organizing this.
Everyone give our professors a round of applause.
All right.
Good.
Okay, thank you both so much for introducing ourselves. And now before we start, let's take a
I'm sorry.
Before we start, let's take a poll of everyone's current opinion before we start the debate so that we can compare it to afterwards debate and see how the votes change after both professors speak. Okay, so as like a general summary of the results that we got, we currently have first question, does free will exist? We have approximately 50% saying yes, approximately 40% saying no, and then approximately 14.3% saying maybe. And then for the second question, can artificial intelligence become conscious in the future? We have approximately 50% saying yes, another 24.2% saying no, and then 29.1% saying unsure or undecided. So it looks like the answers, or the majority answers, as in the largest portion, is yes for both does free will exist and can artificial intelligence become conscious in the future.
Yeah. So I guess we'll see how these results change. But to do that, I think we need to host a debate, right? So the debate format is very simple. What's going to happen is we're going to do an overarching question, and I'm actually going to screen share that right now. Let's see if I can get that up. But we're going to do an overarching question. The overarching question is going to look like the questions you just saw in that form. It's going to be questions like such. Does free will exist? And does AI have the potential of consciousness? As such, we also have sub-questions underneath, which the professors are going to follow as their guidelines for their speeches. What's going to happen is Professor 1 is going to give a 5 to 7 minute speech, just talking about their opinions on it. You can see kind of like general gist outlines of what their opinions are, but there's going to be a lot more nuance in their speeches. After 7 minutes, if there's a little bit of time in those 7 minutes, the other professor has the opportunities to ask questions, but if not, we will just end with 7 minutes of protected time speaking. After 7 minutes have completed, Professor 2 is going to do the exact same thing and give a 5 to 7 minute speech. This is what we're going to call like the case or the constructive or like the general opinion. We're then going to do 15 minutes of what we call crossfire. So professors are allowed to just talk back and forth, ask each other's questions, and pick holes in each other's case. We think this is going to be probably the most fun because we're going to see a little bit of arguing. After that, this is where you guys come in. 15 minutes of questioning for the professors. So you can ask any question that you have for either professor and get their opinion on it. And we'll try to go back and forth with questions for Professor Callard and Professor Kaplan. We're going to repeat this for the first question that you see here, does free will exist? And then for the second question as well, does AI have the potential for consciousness? We're going to take a 5 minute break in the middle too. So if you did not get snacks or food, you can also do that, take a bathroom break, take some notes, maybe ask the professor some questions, all in that time. And then after the 5 minute break and after the next debate, we will conclude by going through post-survey, which is exactly what you just did, but after you've heard this debate, and we're going to talk about the results and how your opinions have changed. Does this sound good for everyone? Yeah. Oh, okay, perfect. So with that, we're going to begin the debate. For the first question, I'm going to introduce Professor Kaplan to begin his constructive speech on the question of does free will exist? And I'm going to get rid of these questions. So if you would like to take a picture now. Just one moment for pictures, and then we will get started. Okay, perfect. I think everyone that's taken a picture or that wants to has already done so. We are going to begin the debate. Professor Kaplan, tell me, do you think free will exists?
No. But I can't take credit for that thought. I didn't originate it. It came out of the whole causal chain of the universe. Let me explain what I mean. So I want to start by making a distinction between the experience of free will, the feeling we have of making choices, and whether or not we are actually making those choices. Because those are two different things. The experience of free will, the feeling that we're making choices, that we're agents in the world, is an experience. It's an experience like any other. It's an inference that the brain is making about the world. And it's an inference that can be wrong. It's unreliable, just like any other sense that we have. We know a little bit now about how the brain gives us that feeling of doing things, of making choices. For example, we believe it has something to do with the fact that the brain is constantly making predictions. The brain is constantly making predictions about what's going to happen in the world because it likes to avoid surprises. And before I do any action, whether it's to pick up this book or to put it down, my brain makes a prediction about what that's going to feel like and what's going to happen and what it's going to look like. And so it knows exactly what's going to happen before I do it. And there's no surprises there. Okay, and that has a lot to do with why I feel like I picked the book up and it didn't just pick itself up. When there are movements my body makes that aren't predicted by my brain, that are surprising. So for example, if I have a seizure and my arms just start moving on their own, those are surprising movements that the brain didn't predict, and I don't have the experience of free will. I don't feel like I'm moving. So this is a feeling, and it's a feeling that can be wrong. We can manipulate it in various ways. It's subject to all kinds of illusions. One of my favorite illusions of will comes from a case of neuropsychological case, which means there's some kind of brain damage and the brain isn't behaving as it normally should. This is a case that we call anosognosia. Typically occurs with damage to the right parietal lobe. And what happens is the person's arm is paralyzed. Their left arm is paralyzed, they're unable to move. However, they're unaware of their paralysis. And this is very strange because their arm is not moving. But if you ask them to move their arm, and the arm just sits there flaccid at their side, and you say, well, why didn't you move their arm? And they say, yes, I did move my arm. They seem to really believe that they're moving, even if you show them in front of a mirror that their arm isn't moving, because the sensation, that feeling, that experience of free will appears to be intact, even though they're not actually able to move. And that's a very compelling feeling that we have. And so we believe it. We believe that we are the author of our actions, that they're coming out of us. But if we think about it a little bit further, it doesn't quite make sense that our actions would arise from just within us. And I think that's what free will means, that I'm choosing and the choice is coming from me. What exactly could that mean? Well, we know that any action the brain takes is preceded by other actions that are also within the brain. And we could sort of follow the causal chain backwards from my hand moving to the activity in my premotor cortex to things that happened before that. And at some point in that chain, I'll be conscious of my decision to move. But there are things that happen in my brain before I'm conscious of the decision to move that are causing my decision to move. And we can actually measure those. We can, with that machine that's right across the hall, we can measure brain activity. And we can actually predict what choices people are about to make before they even are aware that they're going to make a choice. So if we trace this sort of causal chain further and further back, we might be able to attribute all the actions that we do to prior events, whether they're conditions of my brain or states of the world or my genetics, or if we were perfect beings at the beginning of the universe and we could understand everything, perhaps we can predict every action that you are going to take. This is the idea of determinism, okay? That everything is caused in an orderly way in physics, and one thing leads to another, and nothing arises out of nowhere. We don't have any uncaused events in the universe. So it doesn't quite make sense that we would be the originator of our own causes. Some people say, well, determinism isn't true. There's some kind of probabilistic element to the universe, right? If we look at atoms on a microscopic scale, there's things that we can't know exactly everything about an atom. It's subject to the laws of quantum mechanics, which introduce some probabilistic element to the whole circumstance. Maybe when I go to a restaurant, I'm going to make a choice of what to order. Say I go to an Italian restaurant, there's a 90% chance I'm going to order the penne arrabbiata. That just happens pretty much every time I walk into an Italian restaurant. There's a 10% chance that I order something else. But why is it in those few times when I decide to order the spaghetti instead, that I order the spaghetti? Is it because some atom just happened to swerve in my brain due to quantum mechanics? Maybe. But if so, does that give me free will? Is that really what free will is? Just the flip of a coin? If my choice is down to the universe flipping a coin, it's not really my choice. That isn't free will. That isn't really free will in the way that we want it to be. So I think the concept of free will doesn't really make sense if we think about it enough. And to the question, can we understand free will? I think it is within the purview of neuroscience to understand the feelings we have about free will, to understand the psychology of free will, why we feel responsible for our actions, why we feel responsible for some actions and not others. There's a lot of range there. For example, my heart beats itself. I don't have anything to do with that. But my breathing happens on its own most of the time, but I can intervene. Maybe that's in a gray area. I can control my breathing if I want to sometimes. So this is something that is subject to science, this experience of free will. The general question of whether actions could come out of nowhere seems to me like it's an issue of physics. So our third question, is it a neurobiological scientific concept or not? I think we can study that from a scientific point of view, and especially if we consider science to be the general venture of understanding the world rationally. That's what we're doing right now. Is it unsatisfying? And is there a sort of a problem with taking this kind of rational scientific view over a humanistic view? This is our last question here. I think this is a false dichotomy. I think that science can really help us to answer questions about our humanity. And this is one of them. This is a deep question about our place in the universe and our relationship with everything else in the world. Are we the result of everything that came before us? Are we somehow adding to it ourselves? This is a question that science can add to, and it has to do with our humanity. And I don't think there's anything unsatisfying about that. Some people say that, well, if we have no free will, then there's no responsibility. I don't think that's true either. I think it's actually in some cases quite the opposite, that if my actions are going to cause all of your actions, I better be very careful about what I do. And certainly holding people responsible still has value in a world of cause and effect. Whether we punish someone or reward them for their behavior is going to change what they choose in the future. So the fact that we have no free will doesn't mean that we're not responsible for anything and that you guys can just stop showing up to class because, you know, it wasn't your choice. We still have to be responsible. So that's what I have to say about free will. We don't have it.
We're now going to hear, we're going to hear a 5 to 7 minute speech from Professor Callard. And I will probably not be knocking at the point where he has gone over time, but I don't know, maybe a minute over is okay, I guess. These are kind of interesting.
I think I went over, so.
All right, I'll answer the same question. Does free will exist? My answer is yes. So I think human beings have free will at least in ordinary non-pathological situations. There are cases where you don't have it. To say why I think that, I need to say what I think free will is. That is what we have if we have free will. I wasn't 100% clear, but we can get to this later, whether Professor Kaplan was denying that we have free will or whether he was just denying that we have a certain kind of free will. We can talk about that more further along. So, but in any event, let me tell you what I mean by free will, what I think that means. And I don't think this is idiosyncratic to me. I think this is what most people mean by free will. So I'll just give an example. If you think about what it's like to cast a vote in an election, I think most people, myself included, will say, here's how it goes. I went into the voting booth and I voted for candidate A, and there are reasons I chose candidate A rather than candidate B. Maybe candidate A is more honest, or they have a better view about taxes or abortion or immigration, and I acted for or on those reasons. Those reasons explain my choice, but those reasons didn't determine or necessitate or force me to do what I did. Nothing forced me, which is just to say I could have chosen to vote for candidate B. It was open to me with everything as it was at that moment to vote for candidate B. I just didn't vote for candidate B for the reasons I just gave. That is, I can explain why I didn't vote for B, but I absolutely could have voted for B. So in that sense, according to this view, our options, we have genuine options. We have alternative choices that are open and available to us. So I think that's both what I take the normal view of free will to be, and I think that normally we have that capacity or that property that I just described. And at least going in, my reason for thinking that we have that capacity is just that it seems like we have it. Professor Kaplan characterized that appearance in terms of a feeling. I wouldn't put it in terms of a feeling, though I think there probably is such a thing as the feeling of freedom, but I would say it's a judgment. If we think that we're free, right? It seems to us that we're free. Someone could argue that that appearance is false. So I agree with Professor Kaplan that that judgment, like any judgment, could be wrong. It could turn out to be wrong. But we would need an argument for that claim. That is, given that it seems to us that we're free in the sense that I just gave, we need an argument, and it would have to be a good argument, a sound, compelling argument. In a minute, I want to talk about whether we could get such an argument from neuroscience or from the natural sciences more generally. Again, I'm not sure whether Professor Kaplan wants to say we do have freedom of the will, but not understood in the way I just said, or whether he wants to say we don't have it at all. He was emphasizing the notion of determinism. And for many people, determinism is incompatible with free will. I think it's incompatible with free will, so I have to reject determinism. But anyway, we can get to maybe which of those two paths he takes. As to the question, can we understand free will? Is there a satisfying answer? I mean, I just said that I think we have free will, and in a way, that claim entails that I think that we do understand free will. I certainly think that we can understand it, at least potentially. But I do think that there are real questions and difficulties here. That is, I think the theory of free will is not smooth sailing. And I don't think anyone to this point in the very long history of trying to give accounts of free will has given a fully satisfying account of free will. On the other hand, and I'll get to this in just a second, I don't think that the problems or difficulties are problems or difficulties. They're not raised by the sciences. And in a way, I don't think the sciences have something to say about this question. The worries are, so to speak, internal to our first person agential perspective. So we can maybe talk about those worries or problems down the road. But now let me get to I'm going to bundle the question science versus humanistic answer, which is more satisfying, and is free will a neurobiological or scientific concept or not? Professor Kaplan said that he takes this to be a sort of false dichotomy. There's, so to speak, we shouldn't choose between those two things. I think it's a pretty good dichotomy. So I think free will is not a scientific concept, and that's why we can't, I think, even in principle, get a satisfying account of free will from the sciences. I think I want to say something stronger. I don't think that it can even inform the account, but it certainly can't, for example, rule out the claim that we have free will. If you understand free will in roughly the way I was giving a moment ago, that is, you have free will if you can make a choice on the basis of reasons, but you could have made another choice in those same circumstances. Again, I take that to be the intuitive idea of free will. I don't think that any of the concepts in what I just said, that is the concept of choice, reasons, possibility, are scientific concepts. And we could, if we like, call them humanistic concepts. They belong to a very large family of concepts in terms of which we make sense of our lives, make sense of the world. They include consciousness, which we're going to be talking about today, and language and representation, and logic, and rationality, and personhood, and God, and beauty, and right and wrong, and a whole bunch of other concepts. I think the gap between empirical scientific claims about the brain, for example, and claims about any of those phenomena, including freedom of the will, there's a logical gap. That's what I want to emphasize here. That is to say, no claim of the form these neurons are firing entails or is entailed by any claim of the form Joe doesn't have free will. It just doesn't follow as a matter of logic. You can't get from the one to the other. Now you could get there if you build a bridge, right? So you might be able to come up with a proposition which links those two things together. And I take it that Professor Kaplan thinks that there are some of those bridge claims, right? So they would look like mental states are brain states, or mental states are reducible to brain states, or are caused by, or something along those lines. And so, but the first thing to notice is that those bridge claims are not themselves claims in the science in question, in neuroscience or physics or anything else. They're transducing between neuroscience on the one hand and this humanistic set of ideas on the other. So it's in the nature of what I'm calling a bridge claim that you're going to have to step outside the science in question in order to make that claim. And so, and then the second thing to see, which follows from that first claim, is that any reasons we have to accept those bridge claims are going to be usually generated by, and certainly constrained by, our humanistic convictions. That is, by what we think about how things are in terms of free will and everything else. So I think if a neuroscientist takes off their neuroscience hat for a moment and makes a bridge claim, that's great, but first of all, we have to figure out whether the claim is plausible. And I don't mean scientifically plausible, because as I say, it's not a scientific claim in the first place. The claim mental states are brain states is not a scientific claim, because mental states is not a scientific concept in the first place. What you're doing is relating two different, very, very different forms of thought, humanistic thought and scientific thought in that claim. And again, I think we can reasonably reject that claim if it's inconsistent with something that we know by living and acting, namely that we have free will. So, but to say that is not to say that I'm rejecting any scientific claim, because again, the bridge claim is not a scientific claim in the first place. So, great, am I done? Okay. Yeah, great. So I'll one more sentence. So if what I just said is right, then I don't think that neuroscience could even in principle give us a reason to budge from our conviction that we have free will, but something else maybe could budge it. Just wouldn't be that. Okay, thanks.
We knew that would be good when he took his jacket off for that. All right, we're going to. All right, we're going to start the crossfire, and it's going to start with a question from Professor Kaplan, and he's going to ask a question to Professor Callard, and you guys can go back and forth for 15 minutes. Sound good?
Sounds good. Okay, first of all, thank you, Professor Callard, for those thought-provoking comments. My first question has to do with this claim that you made that if you were in the same situation again, that you could have made a different choice, that you weren't bound by the reasons that you voted for candidate X. And I guess I don't quite understand this. So let me imagine a case in which I've got this universe where I voted for candidate X, and a copy of this universe where I'm at that voting booth again, and every atom in that universe is identical to this universe. What is it that causes me to sometimes make a different choice in universe B versus universe A?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, in the sense of determines, nothing causes it, right? That's the whole idea, is that we decide what to do, and nothing forces us to make that decision one way or the other. So if you're looking for a determining cause that differentiates the two universes, the whole idea is there isn't any such determining cause.
So but if your choice is causeless, is it really, can you own it? I mean, is it coming from you? How do you feel ownership over something that is causeless?
Yeah, so I don't think it's causeless. So maybe we need to make a distinction here. This is just a boring semantic point, but I mean, if by cause we mean something like explanation, then I think it does have an explanation, namely the reasons that you act on. If by cause we mean deterministic cause, a thing which necessitates or forces you to do what you do, then I don't think it has a cause. So I'm claiming, maybe wrongly, that there's a gap between those two ideas, and that there can be a cause in the first sense, so an explanation of why you do what you do, without there being a necessitation or determination. That may be wrong, but that's the thought anyway.
Yeah, I guess I can't understand what the difference there is. It feels to me like if there are causes and those causes are identical, that they either cause the same thing every time, or there's some blurriness there, and for some reason my choice is different, but that there isn't really an explanation that decides between those two universes where I vote for candidate X and I vote for candidate Y, other than saying, like, I don't know, some magical will comes into play and makes the choice for me.
Yeah, well, in a sense it is magical, I think, but in one sense of that word. But one distinction to make here is between whether we can make sense of what you did, right? Why did you vote for candidate A? And there you might cite the reasons that I was mentioning. And there's a kind of funny meta question you might ask, which is, given that you could vote for either candidate A or B, why did you vote for A as opposed to B, where that isn't supposed to be heard the first way? And there the answer might be no reason. There's sort of two questions here. One is, explain to me why you voted for A. And there it might be because I like their policies about this. And that needn't be the same answer as the answer to the question, why did you do A as opposed to something else? That's a different question. It's a contrastive question. Let me let you go on though.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between what people know about why they make their choices and why they actually make their choices. So I think, what we understand about why we make our own choices is imperfect and self-serving. And we know there are all kinds of biases in how we explain our behavior. So I sort of take that data and just kind of throw it out, because it doesn't really help us all that much in determining why we really do what we do. But I assume that there is a truth of the matter that explains the choice that we made. And like I said, we can look into the brain and we can actually measure what the upcoming events are that are going to cause me to choose one way or another. From the outside, that isn't clear, and even from my own experience, that might be clear. But there's still going to be some causes to why I chose what I did.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with some of what you just said. In effect, you're raising a really interesting big picture question, which is, what's the relationship between freedom of the will on the one hand and consciousness or conscious access to our mental life on the other? And that's a hard question. It doesn't line up in any obvious way. But so I agree with the first part of what you just said, which is that we sometimes get our reasons wrong. We sometimes think we did something for one reason when in fact we did it for another reason. So that's entirely possible. that would only threaten freedom of the will if you had a certain view about how consciousness relates to freedom of the will. And I think I'm not going to have that view. But I mean, I certainly accept the point that we're often wrong. In fact, we're often fooling ourselves about why we do what we do.
Yeah.
But my thought would be you can still freely do what you do, even if you don't have conscious access to that. That's the claim anyway.
I agree with that. Let me ask you a question about the second topic that you brought up, which is this sort of humanistic versus scientific. And you said that free will or even the concept of mental states is not a scientific concept. To me, that seems like it's just a concept that hasn't been subjected to the rigor of science yet. And we have all kinds of concepts that grow out of culture that turn out to be, some of them turn out to be useful when we examine them, some of them turn out to be wrong when we examine them. But science is just the collection of processes we have for deciding what's true and what isn't true. And so what could it mean that these concepts aren't scientific concepts, except that they just haven't, are you saying they get a pass from being examined by the sort of, rigorous logic of our analysis?
Yeah, so there's a weaker and a stronger move here. The weaker, that is, one question is, is it worthwhile? Is it often illuminating to try to give a scientific reduction of what I was calling a humanistic concept? I think the answer to that question is yes, it is often helpful. It often illuminates the thing. Sometimes we even get a reduction occasionally. Sometimes we get a half reduction, sometimes we don't get any reduction. So I think it's very much worthwhile asking these questions. We're all familiar with cases like this. Einstein started with the concept of time, which is a somewhat scientifically intractable concept. It's a bit intuitive or pre-theoretic or philosophical sounding. And he did what we call, he operationalized the idea of time. He said, forget time, that's too hard to deal with. Let's deal with the behavior of clocks. And he said, I can give you a theory of the behavior of clocks. That's relativity theory, right? Now there's the question, is there anything residual left over in the notion of time? Or is it fully exhausted by Einstein's analysis in terms of the behavior of clocks? That's sort of the question that we're asking here. But I certainly agree with you that it's worth asking these questions. It sounded to me, though, like you were making a much more ambitious claim, which is that inevitably either a humanistic concept gets a scientific reduction or it's meaningless or something. And that I would very much want to resist.
Not that it's meaningless, but that there are concepts that are useful in the sense that they tend to correspond to reality, nature, and there are concepts that turn out to not really correspond to anything that's there. And so how do we know which is which unless we examine it in some way or another? I'm not saying inevitably that every concept reduces to some scientific explanation, but sometimes with a scientific inquiry into a concept, it disappears and turns out to be some kind of an illusion. Absolutely.
Though, again, it seems to me you're equating rigorous examination with science, and I would want to resist that identification. But it turns out, Professor Kaplan, that I'm allowed to ask you questions right now, too. I didn't know that, so can I ask you one?
Please.
Is that all right? Yeah, so you mentioned in your opening statement that you don't take moral responsibility to be threatened by the denial that we have free will, or at least the kind of free will that I sketched. And I want to just push you on that a little bit. That is, what you wound up talking about is holding people responsible, which is an activity. And I think your thought was, it can still make sense to hold people responsible and maybe to punish them in certain circumstances. That's certainly true. But the thing that seems threatened is not the activity of holding people responsible, but the truth of the judgment that we might have taken that activity to express, namely that we think that they're blameworthy. And the question is, can you be blameworthy if you're right about free will? And I don't, so it's not whether we ought to blame people, but whether they're worthy of blame, whether they deserve blame, whether they ought to feel guilty. And I think, first of all, that's a different question. Second of all, I have a hard time seeing how, if we live in the sort of fully determined world that you were describing, that it makes any sense to say, nevertheless, people are morally responsible for what they do. Could you say a little more about that?
Yes.
That thought?
Yes, thank you. First, I guess I just want to say that I'm not sure that I agree with the distinction you made between holding people responsible and the sort of the truth of whether they are responsible or not, as if being responsible is some objective fact about an action and not a decision we make as a culture of how to treat actions. So that's one thing. But the second thing, I guess, is going to force us to dig a little bit deeper into this issue of whether free will is compatible with determinism. And you said that you think that it isn't. And I actually think that there is a form of free will that is compatible with determinism. And it is the form that's relevant for holding people responsible and for feeling responsible and for feeling guilt. And that is the fact that, you know, there's a useful distinction to be made between actions that result from the act of deliberation and forethought. You know, one of the things the human brain is really good at is imagining various futures. I can imagine if I order the penne, what's it going to feel like, and how's that going to taste in all those little tubes? Or if I order the spaghetti, what is that going to feel like? And then I can allow those potential outcomes to influence the action that I make, as opposed to, say, like a reflex, where that action is not the result of any kind of deliberation. And there are some animals and organisms that seem capable of making these kinds of actions and others that don't. And I think most of the time in our folk psychology, when we talk about freedom and free will, we're talking about the kinds of actions that are the result of this sort of thought process, that have proximal causes within the person's process of deliberation. And I think that if our actions do result from such a process, then it makes sense to feel responsible for them, to take responsibility for them. That is what responsibility is. It means that I am the proximal cause of what happened. It doesn't mean that I am the metaphysical originator of what happened.
Right. But I mean, it's certainly true that that's what we would have to say about responsibility if everything else you're saying is true. That's definitely right. But I want to push you on what you were calling the metaphysical side of the equation. So Kant said that ought implies can. To say somebody ought to do something is to say that they can do it. You're saying that if someone robs a liquor store, then they were, at the Big Bang already predestined to rob the liquor store, right? And so it's not the case that they could do otherwise. And I think most of us want to agree with Kant about ought implies can and say it follows that it doesn't make any sense to say that they nevertheless ought to do otherwise than what they in fact do. And now what you're doing is as it were, shifting the question from is it true that they ought to do otherwise to will a certain good outcome be achieved if we yell at them or if we put them in prison? That's an interesting question, but it's a different question. And so I just want to, do you think that you have to give up on the sort of the basic intuitive notion of moral obligation?
No, I think those are different ways of saying the same thing. I think to say that we ought to do something is to say that it benefits us all if we decide that we ought to do that, right? And that, yes, it's true that that person was maybe predestined to rob a liquor store from the beginning of time, but one ought not to rob liquor stores, and that is also true. Incidentally, there's another consequence to believing in determinism, which is that it can actually increase our empathy for others. If you understand that a person's action, this guy who robbed the liquor store, did rob that liquor store because of circumstances, many of which were beyond his control. And maybe he grew up in a poor family, or maybe he was, conscripted into a gang of thieves when he was 12 against his will. We don't know. But if we only attribute people's actions to their own choices, and actually, psychologists have shown that we do have a bias to doing this to other people. We tend to ascribe other people's actions to their own internal states and things that we do to more external states. We give ourselves a break, but we hold other people responsible for the bad things that they do. But determinism gives us a way to actually extend our empathy a little bit further. And so I think it's also useful in that way.
Okay, good. Okay, apparently we have time for one more question. Do you want to ask me a question, or?
I don't have one. So if you have one, or if the audience.
Should we move on? Yeah. Okay. Great.
All right. Perfect. Thank you for the crossfire, both of you. I think they defended their cases quite well. But it seems like there's questions in the crowd. It seems. I don't know. You guys look a little confused. So I think we're going to start by first asking a question from USC. After that question is completed, we're going to ask a UChicago student to ask a question. Please repeat the question because our side can't hear your crowd, your side can't hear our crowd. So both professors, I ask you to repeat the question, answer, and we'll move to the next. So Celine, Professor Kaplan, if you would like to ask for one from your side.
Okay, let's do it. Any questions? Yes.
So I have a question for Dr.
Wait.
Callard.
We're going to give you a microphone. So one moment.
So my question is, so you were saying that you don't believe free will is a scientific concept, correct? So then why are we bound to make worse decisions when we chemically alter ourselves with drugs and alcohol if it's not scientific?
Very good. That's a great question. The claim is a fairly thin or formal claim, which is that the idea of free will and the idea of consciousness and the idea, more generally, the idea of a mental state isn't a scientific concept. Now we can ask the question, which is an interesting question. It's the central question in the philosophy of mind. What is the nature of the mind and how does the mind relate to the body and to the brain in particular? That's a perfectly good question. I wasn't saying we shouldn't ask the question. One thing I was saying is that it's not a scientific question. It's a kind of hybrid question or a question that stands between those two forms of thought. I certainly don't want to deny that there are causal relationships between mental states and brain states. So I think it's absolutely the case that if you take certain things, you'll have certain experiences, right? Or if somebody steps on your foot, you'll feel pain. That's all true. But I think that's consistent with saying the idea of a mental state is not an empirical idea. And then any claims we make like that are not, the claim that mental states are or relate causally to brain states is a philosophical claim, not a scientific claim. Maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
I'd just like to add something about the issue of drugs. To me, raises this interesting point that kind of chips away a little bit, I think, at one of the sort of standard concepts of free will, which is the issue of addiction and how the chemical state of our brain can be altered by drugs such that what we want and the decisions we make feel like they're not actually aligned with what we really want, right? An addict often feels that they don't have a choice and that they don't have free will in the decision. I think it's an interesting gray area to consider.
Okay.
Question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll take a question from here.
Hi, Professor. I believe that you, on the second question of the form, if I remember correctly, you answered no to the question of is our thinking or our mental activity conscious? Am I remembering that correctly?
This is for Professor Kaplan.
Yeah. So Professor Kaplan, the question was, did you say yes to is our thinking and acting conscious?
Well,
which is one of our questions.
I mean, really, a very small part of it is. It's really the tip of the iceberg of what it does that's conscious.
You responded no to the question of is our thinking conscious? Is that right?
Professor, what was your stance on is our thinking conscious?
Yeah, I think a lot of our thinking is not conscious. So some portion of our thought, what the brain does is conscious. A lot of it isn't. Right now I'm speaking to you, and your brain is doing all kinds of things to analyze the stream of sounds that are coming into your ear that you are unaware of. You are aware of the very end of that process, which is the meaning of my speech, but you're not aware of the parsing of the constant stream into phonemes and words. And there's just so much processing that happens in the mind that we are unaware of, but we're also conscious of some of it.
Okay, I think we have a follow-up on our side. Do you have something to add?
No, I don't.
You were just like here to say something.
Well, because I thought you were saying that sort of rejecting consciousness as a concept and saying, well, no, none of our thinking or none of our deliberation is conscious, which I was more interested in sort of pushing back against that. That doesn't seem to be your view.
Right. No, I do believe in consciousness, and I think in the second part today, when we start to talk about artificial intelligence consciousness, we'll probably dig more into what that means.
Perfect. We'll look for a question from USC.
Okay, so which one should I take? Okay, I'm going to start with
how will she make this choice without free will?
So I have a problem for Professor Kaplan. And you stated that you think free will doesn't exist because like the causation chain and some brain activity issues. However, I believe that the causation only sure to happens in the macro world. But like we're not sure that if causation exists in the micro or the quantum world. Like in the quantum world, there might be actual like real probabilities. Like in the real world, if you flip a coin, you know all the parameters, it's not random, but in the quantum world, there's some random things. And I believe that's where like humans' free will exists. Like, how do you think about this?
Okay, well, that's fair. Maybe that's true. There are real questions about whether those probabilities at the quantum level actually influence the activity of macro level objects like the brain. It's been difficult to establish that, so I'm skeptical. But let's say that they do. Let's say you're right. Let's say there's some true probability at the microscopic level. How does that give you free will? I mean, if your choice is probabilistic and it's just coming from the universe flipping a coin, for example, the atom goes this way or it goes that way, or there's some probability. It's not you that's determining the location of that atom. It's still just chance of the universe. So that's not the kind of free will that most people want to claim as their own. It's hard for me to see how you have ownership over those quantum events yourself. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I can say that we're not sure about it, but it's probably can do that, but we haven't studied that yet. Like it also could be that we choose that, right?
That we choose what?
Like for the quantums to act that way, something like that.
Oh, so like some kind of interaction between our own consciousness and the quantum level.
Yes.
If that's true, but then that all those things that are causing things to happen at the quantum level from our own mind are also themselves caused by prior events. And so it's hard to locate where you are in that chain and which part of the universe that you're carving out as being the part that's you, that's causing things that's separate from everything else.
Can I just add a word to that? This is the place where I think we agree, Professor Kaplan. That is, I also think that quantum mechanical indeterminacy is not the right place to look for an account of freedom of the will, partly for the reasons you were just giving. That is, it looks like that sort of indeterminacy, so to speak, if that's all we can say, those seem like cases of randomness, and that's certainly not what we think we have in the case of free action. So
we want reasons, right?
Yeah.
Oh wow. This is stressful. Professor Callard, do you have a person that you just liked better?
All right, so this is a question for you, Professor Callard. So Professor Kaplan has been arguing on the dimension of the kind of material, touchable by science story, which is a very compelling story. That you are going from physical stimulus, and there's physical stuff with atoms happening in the brain, and that leads to behavior, and that's one play. You're giving a very compelling story for a different play that science can't touch. And you say you reject the bridge that mental states are equal to brain states. But it also feels deeply compelling to the point of if we are rejecting everything we understand about causality, to not have a bridge there. In fact, a bridge that seems to, as you say, kind of really link these concepts, because we experience things that relate to our understanding of the physical world. So it seems that you kind of can't hold all of these three things together. I'm presuming you're not doubting the entirety of the physical world.
Right.
So what is the bridge that allows this to work?
Yeah, good. Sorry, Professor Kaplan, could you hear all that?
Not really.
Okay. Sorry, there's a lot there. So I want to repeat the question, but I'm not sure how to compress it.
Again, I'll give you
one way to put it is, do I have anything plausible to say about the mind-body problem? That'd be one way to put it. Yeah. So as I said, I certainly think that there are causal relationships between brain states and mental states. I think saying that is not. Maybe let me say two things. Let me first make a distinction which we haven't made yet, and which I think is maybe worth making, partly because there have been some examples, for example, Professor Kaplan's paralysis example at the beginning, where I think it starts to matter. Freedom of the will and freedom of action are not the same idea. So you have freedom of the will if you can freely choose, in the sense that I gave before, what to do. But sometimes you can freely choose, but your choice is not efficacious. It's not causally effective, right? So if somebody ties you up in a chair, you can't leave, right? So you don't have freedom of action, but you might have freedom of the will, in the sense that you can decide to try to escape or try to decide not to escape. And the traditional problem is a problem about the will and not about action. Nobody thinks that we have, we often have some freedom of action, but that's not the question at issue here. And I think the issue you're raising mostly applies to what we might call freedom of action rather than freedom of the will. Having said that, I want to concede to you that it certainly seems like there's some interesting, exciting causal relationship between mental states and brain states. There are many different possible relations there, right? And I think only a few of them are going to rule out free will of the kind that I was describing. Some of them will, and some of them won't. But I won't go through all the possible stories here. That is, there could be the cases of causal overdetermination. There could be a natural law that links a certain kind of mental state to a certain kind of brain state. We have a bunch of options here, and so all I want to insist on is that however that falls out, the fact is that we have free will in the sense that I gave. But I think that's at least consistent with many possible answers to the mind-body problem. It isn't consistent with identity theory, with the claim that mental states are brain states. And Professor Kaplan can tell us whether he thinks that that's true, whether mental states are identical to brain states. That would certainly rule it out. And so then I would have to fight against that sort of materialism on its own terms, and quite apart from the free will question. So, there's a lot more to be said there, but Professor Kaplan, do you want to say anything about the mind-body problem, sort of as distinct from the free will problem?
I'm wary of opening that can of worms right now. I'm partly because I'm not really sure what I think about it. It's a very difficult question. Do I believe in the identity between mental states and physical states? Probably more than you do, but I'm not really willing to put a flag down there.
Great.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and we can take that from the USC side.
Yes, we do have a question.
So my question was, and I don't know if this is completely related to the question that was just asked, but basically a lot of people could define the self as being a accumulation of things. For example, your experiences and maybe even the way that your brain, naturally works. Like people could say, for example, your nurture and your nature all encompass yourself. So I was wondering what each professor defines as the self. I think that would kind of relate to how the answer of the question would be.
So the question is about how we define the self and what we consider the self. I agree that's a really important question. That's central to a lot of these issues that we're discussing today. It's a complicated concept. There are a lot of different ways of defining it. I like to make the distinction, because it's important for our neuroscience work, between the self that we experience in the present moment, which has to do with all of the perceptions that you have of the here and now, whether it's where the borders of your body are, to the feelings from inside the viscera of your whole organism, to feelings of the floor on your feet, if you become aware of those. So those are sort of present moment experiences that constitute the self in one moment. But then we also have this self that extends across time. And that self is something like an interpretation that we've built, a story, a narrative, an autobiography of who we think we are. And actually, that's a lot of my research is about understanding how the brain builds that story, and it has to do with our our beliefs and our identities and how they're wrapped up in that story. And so those are the two things that I think are important for the self. And I think maybe we'll come back to that point when we talk about artificial intelligences. But I'm curious to hear what Professor Callard thinks.
I mean, I think I would agree with your characterization. I mean, at least broadly, your characterization of the self understood at a time. The second part, you were talking in terms of a story or a narrative, and those words suggest to me that maybe you think that story is not true, or there's a bit of an illusion here of personal identity across time or something like that. If that's what you were implying, there I would disagree with you. It seems to me that we exist in something like the way you were just indicating across time, and that's why we can that's how we can make sense of the fact that we, plan things and remember things and are morally responsible for things, and a whole lot of our life wouldn't make any sense at all, except on the assumption that we persist through time, and that had better not be just an illusion. It had better be true. Otherwise, all those thoughts are false. Sorry. Yeah.
I say it's all an illusion. I phrase it in a way that I think is agnostic to that. A story can be true, a story can be fictional, but it isn't necessarily true. So there's definitely ways in which we can build stories about ourselves that aren't true, and there are certainly experiences we can have of ourselves that are illusory. But I didn't mean to imply that they're always wrong.
Yeah. Okay, with this, we're going to conclude the first half of debate. So a round of applause for our professors. Right now, we're going to take 2 to 3 minutes of break. We're going to come back and they're going to start debating AI consciousness and consciousness in other beings. So it'll get a little heated. Please come back in 3 minutes. Okay.
Okay, so the second question is, does artificial intelligence have the potential of consciousness? Professor Callard, are you ready?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so we're going to have a total of 7 minutes. Please start your time now. Got this.
So my answer to that question, does AI have the potential for consciousness, is no, it can't be conscious, but I have to explain what I mean by that because it's a little tricky. So I mean that AI as such, AI in as much as it's AI, can't be conscious. Indeed, I think that in as much as it's AI, or sort of under the description AI, I don't think that it can even engage in unconscious thinking or reasoning. And so my argument here would be the famous Chinese room argument, which many of you are familiar with. Pat Hayes, who's an important computer scientist and AI researcher, once made the joke that his field consisted entirely of the ongoing research program of trying to refute the Chinese room argument. There have been hundreds of attempted refutations, but my own feeling is that it's sound. It's a good argument. So here's how it would go. I know very little about AI, so the first part of this may be false. I don't know, but I take it that ultimately speaking, AI, despite the complications in how it develops, is basically still, we should understand it in terms of programs getting implemented on some hardware. And a program is a purely formal concept. That is, it's a syntactical concept. It's a concept, one of operating on formally defined elements or symbols, rather than a semantic concept, a concept about meaning. And syntax is not sufficient for semantics. The Chinese room argument is supposed to be a reminder or an illustration of that fact. If you don't understand Chinese, you could still successfully run the program for Chinese by understanding and following instructions in some language that you do understand. If you're in a room, you could take in Chinese characters, which mean nothing to you. You could read a rule book in English, and you could put out the right outputs in Chinese without understanding what those are either. And if you did that, you would successfully pass the Turing test. The people outside the room would think that you mean and understand things in Chinese, but you don't mean and understand anything in Chinese. That's the point of the whole point of the argument is intuitively that's true. Intuitively, you don't have any understanding or meaning whatsoever, even though people would reasonably but falsely conclude from the outside that you did. So forget consciousness. I think even unconscious thought isn't really possible here. You can't come to be a meaning-having, conscious thinking being simply by virtue of implementing a program. And so qua AI, under that description, I don't think that it's possible for AI to be conscious. I think that a system that was in fact an AI system could happen to be conscious, but it wouldn't be conscious by virtue of implementing the programs. So that's the claim I want to make. Another question that we had here under this heading is it feasible to measure consciousness in other systems? Do we have epistemic access to other systems, other people's minds? I'll treat that as one question. My answer is, and it's a terrifying answer, I mean, that is for me, is I'm not sure whether we have access to other people's minds. I'd like to point out that there's a tension even in our everyday thinking about this question. That's forget science, forget philosophy, just in our everyday lives. I think there's a bit of a, we're torn in two directions about this a little bit. On the one hand, we're all familiar with the fact that we don't always know what another person is thinking or feeling, that the person can keep their thoughts or feelings hidden from us, and that they can hide them not just sort of temporarily or locally, but systematically. On the other hand, if we see a bowling ball fall on somebody's foot and we see the person start screaming, it seems absurd to say that our belief that they're in pain is just a kind of hypothesis that we're sort of inferring it handles the data or something like that. What we would normally say is, I can see that this person is in terrible pain. But I don't think that those two thoughts, that I just articulated, really fit together with each other. And I think we both have them from what I was calling earlier, the humanistic point of view. That is, before we even get to science, we're not quite sure how accessible other people's minds are, just so to speak, just from our in terms of our everyday life. So that's why I'm uncertain about the answer to this question. And I'll take a whack at one last question under here. Does AI consciousness impact humanity? I already gave you the answer. I think AI isn't and can't be conscious, so AI consciousness can impact humanity, but AI can definitely impact humanity. It's already doing that. I don't feel particularly well positioned to make predictions about what that impact is going to be or whether it's going to be good. As we all know, some people think that AI is going to destroy the world or take over and produce some dystopic, nightmarish situation. Maybe it will, I don't know. But at the more mundane level, I'm confident that I have students right now who are getting ChatGPT to write at least parts of their papers. And I think for that reason and many other reasons, we probably will need in the not too distant future to change in important, maybe even in radical ways, what education looks like. Maybe I yield the rest of my time. Professor Kaplan, do you want to go?
On here, okay, good. All right, so wow, that's really interesting that that you believe that AI can't be capable of unconscious thinking. That's going to lead to some good discussion, I think. I feel like what we've seen from artificial intelligence in the last year or so has effectively refuted the Chinese room argument. I mean, we have seen that it's possible for an artificial intelligence to implement things like language translation without a program, without syntax, without a set of rules. The way that deep learning models work is not by having an explicit set of rules that they're following. It's by forming a set of associations in much the way that human brains form associations. So essentially, they build a semantic network in the same way that your brain builds a semantic network. And that's starting to look a lot like meaning. I think when it comes down to it for this question, I do believe that artificial intelligence could be conscious, mostly because I believe in some version of functionalism. And that is that what really matters when it comes to consciousness is what the thing does. If a system acts in ways that look like they're conscious, if it does exactly what a conscious being does, if you create an artificial intelligence that for all intents and purposes does everything that a human being does, it is going to be conscious. The alternative is, there's one of these philosophical thought experiments that, can you imagine a zombie, and what philosophers mean by zombie is a little different than what Hollywood means by a zombie. A zombie is a creature that looks exactly like a person. It could be any one of you or someone sitting next to you in this audience right now who behaves exactly like a human being, but actually isn't conscious inside, right? And from one perspective, there's no way of really knowing. You think that you don't really have access. Professor Callard alluded to the fact that we only have partial access to other people's minds. We can certainly tell a lot of things about what people are thinking, but we can't really get inside. And so could somebody be a total zombie? I don't think so. I don't think the concept makes sense. I think if somebody actually, if you realistically take the thought experiment seriously, that the robot or whatever it is behaving exactly like a human being down to a T. They have memories of their childhood. They get sad and they are going to grieve when their parent dies. They are going to be anxious when they're about to get up in front of a room in front of other people. If it does all of these things, it's going to be hard for us to say that it isn't conscious. This issue, I guess the other thing I'd like to add to this question of access to other minds is that, well, I agree it's a really important point that we're not, that we're kind of ambivalent about this when it comes to other people. We know that there are some things that we don't have access to. But people are kind of a special case. You know, when it comes to most of the world, we are pretty clear on what's conscious and what isn't. Nobody came in here and mistook the chair that they're sitting on for a conscious being, for example, right? There are even organisms that pretty much everybody agrees aren't conscious, like bacteria. And then maybe there are some gray areas like, you know, insects. I personally don't think insects are conscious, but that's motivated reasoning maybe. So there's a gradation of what we perceive to be conscious, and there are gray areas, but there are times when it's clear to us. And we can also gain access to other people's minds now in ways that we couldn't in the past. So just to go back to brain imaging, one of the techniques that we use in our research here is this basically a form of mind reading, where from measuring the brain activity with functional imaging techniques while people are doing things, we can actually decode what the contents of their minds are. If I ask you to imagine a picture, I can look at the activity in your visual cortex and I can tell you whether you were imagining a cow or imagining a house. That's access to people's conscious minds from the outside, from an objective scientific approach that we didn't have in the past. There's even a group in Japan who did a study where they were able to decode the content of people's dreams while they slept, right? So we are gaining this kind of access to people's minds. I guess the other thing to point out about our perception of consciousness is that we do also a pretty good job of determining when those around us are conscious and when they aren't, right? I can tell that pretty much nobody in here is sleeping right now, for example. You're all awake, which is great. You seem to be conscious, and I'd be willing to bet quite a bit of money that I'm right about that. Okay, so the second question is, I guess I talked about our large language models like ChatGPT capable of simulating consciousness and to what extent. I don't think they do right now, but I think in principle they could. And given that they could, I think this is going to have a huge impact on humanity. I mean, once we have to start treating artificial intelligences as conscious, because they are, we're going to have to change our entire relationship to them in a lot of important ways. I mean, the whole basis of our moral system is based on considering the suffering of other conscious beings, right? There was one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, when Commander Data, who's an android, he's a robot made of metal, and he's the property of Starfleet, and they want to disassemble him. And he doesn't want to be disassembled because he is a sophisticated enough consciousness that he has some degree of self, and they hold a whole trial to decide whether Commander Data has the right to exist. I think that's the kind of question that we are going to have to grapple with going forward as artificial intelligences become consciousness. What kind of rights do we have to afford them, given the kinds of consciousnesses they might be having? Can we treat them as property, or is that a form of slavery? So I think it's going to be an important question for us to ask going forward, even though it is a difficult one. So I think now is the period where we ask each other questions.
I think so, yeah.
Yes. Thank you both so much for the very amazing speech. We're going to have actually 10 minutes of classifier instead of 15 minutes because we are running low on time. But Professor Callard, we're going to have you ask the first question whenever you're ready.
Sure, yeah. So you were saying, Professor Kaplan, that you think that we're already there in terms of consciousness, or at least or mentality. I think you were saying that. I want to, and that I think you said that AI has already, in effect, refuted the Chinese room argument. I want to make a distinction. One is, does it pass the test? And the other is it a good test, right? Is it a good test of mentality or consciousness? And to answer the first question, I think you're right, is yes. If it hasn't already, it certainly will. The question is whether it's a good test in the first place. And that is, the argument is designed to show that simply implementing a program is not going, that can't constitute being conscious or being, having a mental state. You said that you're a functionalist, and of course, functionalism is that view. It's the view that what it is to believe something or desire something or be in pain is to satisfy a certain program description. It's to be functionally correct in terms of the behavior. And from my own point of view, that's an enormous bullet to bite. That is, it seems clear to me that somebody could, for example, feel an excruciating pain, but not have any of the normal behavioral, outer behavioral behaviors that we associate with pain. It might be that never happens. There's also the epistemic question: how do we know whether it happens? But your claim is very strong. It's that what it is to be in pain is to satisfy a certain a certain program description, and that seems to me that's a very strong claim. And it seems the very conceivability of somebody in great pain who isn't acting, as we would say, as though they're in pain, refutes that. So can you say a little more about functionalism?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I totally agree. It's possible for someone to be in pain without some of the overt behaviors associated with pain. For example, if somebody is under the influence of some kind of a drug that cuts off their ability to move. So if you're totally paralyzed by some kind of, too much Botox, for example, you can't move your body to express the pain. But that doesn't mean there are no functional consequences going on inside your brain if those functional relationships aren't there. And I think it actually raises an important issue for artificial intelligences, which is that many of the functional relationships that are important have to do with the brain's relationship with its body. And pain is something that comes from the way that the brain senses certain biochemical and kinetic events that happen within a body. And it doesn't really make sense to implement those functions in a disembodied artificial intelligence. And so this is an argument we've made recently that it's possible that by having artificial intelligences that become very, very, very smart and don't have bodies, what we're going to end up doing is creating a race of essentially sociopathic robots, because they are going to be really good at understanding the world and being able to manipulate it and respond to it, but not actually be able to feel anything like pain or regret or guilt or a lot of the feelings that are the basis of some of our moral behaviors as humans. And so it is certainly possible that an artificial intelligence that doesn't have a body will have necessary limitations on it. And if we're trying to create conscious robots, I don't know if we collectively agree that that's a good goal to have, but if we are doing that, then it may be important for us to build them with a real or simulated body at some stage of their development, at least. I guess I can ask a question back to you now, which is that you said that you don't think that artificial intelligences can even have unconscious thought. And I wonder what you mean by that, since it seems like they are capable of so much information processing that is more or less equivalent to the kind of thinking that we do unconsciously.
Yeah, well, so again, the Chinese room argument may be unsound, but if it is sound, it takes down not just the possibility of something's being conscious by virtue of implementing a program, but having any mental states at all, conscious or unconscious. The idea of a mental state, as I understand it, is the idea of something like meaning, understanding, intending, things like that. And the argument is designed to show that, again, the point is not that there couldn't be a being made out of metal or silicon or some other thing that was conscious or that had a mind. There definitely could be such a thing, as far as I'm concerned. The question is whether it has a mind by virtue of implementing the program, or to put it even more strongly, the question is the implementation of the program its mentality or its consciousness? And the argument is designed to show that the answer to that question is no. So again, it doesn't just rule out conscious mentality. It rules out any mentality. It rules out believing, desiring, intending, hoping, fearing, any of that stuff. Because again, in order to do those things, you would need to mean or understand. You'd have to have a semantics and not just a syntax. You mentioned building semantic networks. I'm not familiar with that. I'd be very interested to see whether that's just a label or whether that really is semantic. That's in effect the question that we're arguing about here.
What I guess the question is, what constitutes real semantics, and what exactly do you mean by running a program? Because in the thought experiment itself, a program is like sort of like following a set, like a lookup table, like a set of rules, and that's one kind of a program. And I can see how the argument applies to a program like that. But does it apply to any kind of system that's set up to take inputs and outputs, or what exactly constitutes a program?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think you know as well as I do what so to speak, the standard definition of a program is. I know very little about AI, and I understand this much. The way that we wind up with ChatGPT is very, very different from the way that we wound up with programs in the old days, right? It isn't a matter of writing the program in any ordinary sense. It's a very complicated process of creating bots and all the rest of it. I leave it to everybody else to answer this question, therefore. But I take it that that's sort of an answer to the how question. It's not an answer to the what question. The thing that is created via that very, very complicated sort of evolutionary process is a bunch of programs, I take it. And the Chinese room argument applies to any program.
I'm not sure it is a bunch of programs. I mean, it's like a bunch of interconnected nodes in the same way. I mean, I guess are we a bunch of programs? So you would probably say no, it seems like. We arise from a very similar process. So I don't know. Do you think there is a test possible for consciousness, or do you think it's completely impossible to test from the outside whether a system is conscious?
Yeah, I mean, that gets a bit to the question that I spoke to a little bit earlier. I mean, that's in effect the problem of other minds. And I take that to be, for the reasons I was indicating, a tricky question anyway, so to speak. It's a tricky question quite apart from any scientific thoughts about this and any sort of philosophical thoughts in any ambitious sense of that word. I think we're just not sure how to think about our access to other people's mind. So I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I'm torn about that. I'm not sure how to think about it.
I think we agree about that.
Say that again?
I think we agree about that.
Okay, great. Maybe I just want to, can I keep pushing you on functionalism?
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, one point to make is that when I gave the example of a person who's in pain, but who isn't acting like they're in pain, you, as it were, retreated to the brain and said, well, we can do it via the brain. I take it that functionalism is precisely not supposed to appeal to the brain, right? That is, there are two very different kinds of theory of the mind, both of them broadly materialist, but one of them says we should identify mental states with brain states, so to speak. That's the place to look. And functionalism is precisely a sort of information theoretic conception of what a mental state is. It says it doesn't matter what the whether you can do it, you can run it on any hardware at all, at least in principle. And so we're supposed to not be looking at neuron firings. We're supposed to be looking at the broad perceptual inputs and the broad behavioral outputs. So do you see functionalism as consistent with or working together with some kind of identity theory or mind-brain identity theory?
Yeah, I think it is consistent with that. I mean, the idea is that in any particular instance, there's an identity, right? So when it comes to human beings, there's an implementation of consciousness that uses neurons and cells and all of these things. And in order to understand the function of the one great example we have of consciousness, we have to look to those things to understand exactly what they're doing. And so, that's why it's hard to characterize something like pain in the abstract without looking at what the real implementation is in the biological system to understand what pain is. And then, by analogy, finding those functions in other system would get the pain.
Okay, good.
Thank you both for the very amazing classifier section. I think it is time for us to move on to audience questioning, because because how amazing this debate is. We are a little more short on time now. But right, so let's start with UChicago's question this time. So does anyone in UChicago has a question right now?
Do you want to
Okay. So I take that when we try to use a functional definition for thinking, for example, or to have a consciousness, I take that when something produces a sequence of words, we don't take it to be automatically conscious, because I can easily write a program to produce a sentence, but we only take it to be conscious when it actually intends to say something, that is, it actually understands the meaning of those words and is actually trying to convey some meaning to the audience. So do you think that when we use ChatGPT is actually it actually understands what it's saying, and that is actually like talking to you as a human would do?
Is it that question for me?
Yes, could you hear that, Professor Kaplan?
Here, it's a question about, does ChatGPT really intend to say what it's saying, and is it really understanding you when it responds to you? And those are really difficult questions. I don't rule out the possibility that it understands in a very important sense what it's saying, because it connects. It's not just spitting out words. You said it's easy to come up with a program that responds to you, spits out words, but it turns out it's not so easy, because in order to be able to do this, it has to have a whole semantic network. And the only reason it's able to do this is because it has access to such a large amount of information that it's aggregated and basically extrapolated semantic information about the world to understand what the meanings of words are in different contexts and in different situations, and also to understand something about the ebb and flow of conversation and how people respond to each other, and what the subtext is of a particular question. There's all these nuances that it really isn't easy at all. And so once it's doing those kinds of things, I think one of the things we've learned is that responding in a meaningful way and having a conversation, maybe that isn't enough for consciousness, having meaning and semantics, because most of us don't really believe that ChatGPT is conscious, even though in a traditional sense it passes the kind of a Turing test. You can't really often tell that you're talking to a machine instead of a computer, but that doesn't turn out to be enough to completely convince us that the thing is conscious. So there's got to be something else there that we require.
Do you want to take a question?
Yeah, should we take one over here?
Yes. Does anyone
Up there somewhere? Let's take guy with the.
There's a lot of questions here.
Maybe. Recently
Okay.
new.
Okay, let's start with that one.
Ask one, no, you didn't ask one. Hood man.
Sorry.
For Professor Callard, so conscious human evolved from unconscious bacteria which only has sensors. And can you name one thing that's stopping unconscious AI to be involved into consciousness that it cannot have during the journey to have conscious?
Let me take the first part of your thought first, and then we get to ChatGPT. It's a really interesting fact about the universe that consciousness came into existence, and that it came into existence gradually and slowly. I'm not 100% sure that Professor Kaplan is allowed to say what I just said, because he thinks that consciousness is to be understood functionally, and even very, very, very simple systems are implementing a program that is a functional program. Arguably, rocks are implementing a functional program. The program is stay where you are, right? That's a very, very simple program. But so if you identify mentality with running a program, it's hard not to be a panpsychist. And I think you aren't a panpsychist, or you can tell us whether you are, right? You're not, okay, right. Yeah. But anyway, my own feeling is that it is true that not everything is conscious, and that consciousness arose in certain places in the history of life. As for ChatGPT, I mean, again, I'm sort of repeating myself at this point, but ChatGPT can definitely, I think, simulate consciousness and mentality. It's already doing that. As Professor Kaplan just said, it's already fooling people. People already think that it's a conscious human being when it's in fact ChatGPT. So it's definitely passing the Turing test, I think. That's for sure. The question is whether passing the Turing test is sufficient for mentality and for consciousness. That's the big question here. And I'm saying it isn't sufficient for that. If you ask me, so what does ChatGPT have to do in order to have mentality and consciousness? I'm not sure how to answer that question. It has to mean and understand things. It has to hope and intend and fear. If you're asking me to give an analysis of those ideas in non-mental terms, I can't do that because they are mental, right? So as I said, I certainly think that a robot could come to be conscious and to have a mind and to do things intentionally. The question that's relevant to the ChatGPT story is, can it do it? Can its having a mental state simply consist in its passing the Turing test? If you're a functionalist of a certain sort, you have to say that the answer to that question is yes, and I want to say it's no. I'm not sure this fully answers the question that was asked, but at least speaks to it a little bit.
I want to say something about this. First of all, how amazing is it that we live in a time when there are machines that pass the Turing test? That is incredible that we're having this conversation and that has happened. I do think that consciousness emerged gradually throughout the course of evolution. I don't think that's incompatible with functionalism, because functionalism doesn't say that any system that has inputs and outputs is conscious. It has to implement certain functions. It has to have a certain kind of functional relationship within itself to be conscious. A car is not conscious, right? It does all kinds of complicated things. So the question for us as scientists is, what kind of arrangement does a functional system have to have in order to be conscious? And the Turing test is maybe a sort of naive version of that, an initial hypothesis would be like, well, maybe if it could fool a person into thinking it's a person. I don't think that's a good, that's not a rigorous enough test of the complexity of the functional system that we're dealing with.
Can I just follow up on that? So set aside my dumb rock example, and take vending machines. Do you think vending machines have minds? Because they're the program profile is awfully similar to something that believes that you've given it a dollar bill and wants to give you candy when you give it a dollar bill.
No, if we get into the nitty-gritty of this, I think the particular kinds of functional things that have to exist within an organism or within an entity to be conscious have to do with having explicit maps of the internal state of that thing. So a vending machine, for example, doesn't have any representation of itself that reaches the kind of complexity that a conscious being does. And so there's certain kinds of things like that that appear to be important for it that do help to rule out those cases that nobody really thinks are conscious. But what the details of those are not resolved, but very interesting to think about.
Want to go?
I wanted to ask a question, particularly kind of on a functional perspective about whenever you have a program, you kind of have an objective function, right? And you give them the purpose. Humans, in that regard, seem to be pretty bad at an objective function, the generally called purpose, right? So I want to know, like, when ChatGPT, we give it a message, it gives an answer. Eventually, it's a character limit. We fail to define it consistently. So how do we come to terms with this distinction?
Sorry, I think I don't quite get that last part. What's the thing that it runs up against?
Right. So how do we come to the distinction of programs eventually optimize, right, and find a limit? We optimize and to a limit of, I want to be the best musician, and then I change my mind, I want to be the best mathematician. I change my mind. Outside from the pre-program, I need to eat and sleep.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't think I fully understand the question, so it's going to be hard for me to repeat it. But let me start at the very beginning of what you said. I mean, and maybe we can work our way into the question. The word function. I've been using the word function partly because Professor Kaplan said he's a functionalist. functions in the sense that we've been talking about are not the same idea. It's not expressing the same idea as functions in the sense of purposes or aims or goals, right? So it's there's the idea of function in the teleological sense, the sense of a goal or aim. And you were bringing up that sense of the word function. And so let me just ask you a question. Is your question leaving the notion of a function that we've been talking about in connection with the Turing test and so forth, and just introducing a new idea, or did you take those to be the same idea, or?
Well, I think them to be the same idea in this case.
Right? I see.
Because there's a hard-coded or even variable function in some code.
Yeah.
And that is an essential part, even if we think about it in the teleological sense of functionalism.
Yeah.
And it translates the teleological and the actual sense of the function.
Okay, yeah. I apologize. I think I'm just not getting the move. So that's on me. So maybe can you email me and we'll talk? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to?
No, I mean, I couldn't quite hear it, but I guess I can help. I can find what I mean by functionalism a little bit better if that helps. I mean, basically just that what something is in the sense of what it does. So you can have a shower that you build out of a tube of plastic, and as long as it rains water down on you, it's a shower. It can be made of totally different materials and do the same thing, and as long as it does that thing, it's going to be a shower. So as long as an entity does what the human brain does, for example, it's going to be conscious. It's the idea of functionalism.
Yeah. But do you agree with me, Professor Kaplan, with what I just said, that something that is in that sense fits a functional profile needn't have a function in the sense of a telos or aim or goal?
Have a purpose or in a teleological sense. Yeah, I agree with you. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, we're done with questions. Okay.
One here, I think. Question up there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My question is for Professor Callard. So you speak about mental states having to be discussed specifically in mental terms, so fear and love and other experiences. But can you actually provide a definition of what that mental language and what that mental life is? That's not simply a negative definition, i.e., it's not just that which cannot be explained by science. Can you provide a more concrete, positive definition of what that is?
Yeah. Sorry, did everybody hear the question? I take it we heard the question. So great. You're asking a lot of me. This is a tall order. You're asking me to define what a mind is, or what mentality is, or what a mental state is, and I'm not convinced that that's possible. I'm not sure that we can analyze that in simpler terms, even when the terms are what I was calling humanistic as opposed to scientific. I do think, and this has come up a little bit in our discussion of the Turing test, that the concept of mind and the concept of meaning are very closely related to each other. In fact, etymologically, those are the same word, mind and meaning. And so one way to think about mental states is that they're states which have a meaning, but I doubt that you're going to be satisfied with that. You're going to say, yeah, what's meaning, right? And that, again, I think we're probably close to bedrock in terms of that. I could certainly talk around it and give more examples, but I think what you want is an analysis in even more fundamental terms, and I'm not sure that that's possible or necessary. Professor Kaplan, do you want to? I don't know, say anything about
that? That's a tall order. Those are difficult terms to define.
Okay, I think with this we're going to conclude questions because we do want people to be able to go home and sleep. So with that, I think that first let's give a large round of applause for these professors. And we're going to do just one more thing before we end. You guys remember the QR code you guys scanned at the beginning? Very important, because now we're going to scan a second one where you guys will be able to re-vote, and we're going to see a comparison of what you guys said from the beginning to the end. So I'm going to figure out technology. We're going to screen share. And feel free to scan this. There were around 160 responses in the first poll, so I don't think there's 160 of us now, but we'll try to get around that number. Has everyone at least got the QR code? If you have, no. All right.
Has everyone here at USC finished the poll?
Has everyone finished the form? Does anyone need a second to fill it out?
Does anyone need more time here? Okay, just good.
Okay. So with that, we're just going to do a quick verbal explanation of what happened. So in the first poll, when we were asked, does free will exist? 49.7 of you, or percent of you, said yes, that you do think free will exists. Now 47.8% of you. So that number did drop. And then the number of you, or the percent of you that said no, free will does not exist, 35.8% in the previous poll. Now 33.6% of you. Oh yeah. This is the real win. Okay. But I think what this means is a lot of you are just more confused right now. So, because 14.5% of you said you were unsure previously, and now 18.6% of you said you were unsure, which is fair. I'm also confused. All right. Now the question, can AI become conscious in the future? In the previous poll, 46.7% of you said yes. In the current poll, 42.5% of you say yes. Oh. Professor Kaplan, I feel like your response to this is quite, wow. Anyways, question on can AI become conscious? 24.2% of you said no in the previous poll. 30.1% of you said no. What?
It's just zoomed in.
And then in the previous poll, 29.1% of you said unsure. Less of you are now unsure. 27.1% of you said you were unsure in the current poll. So it seems like you guys clarified some things for a few people. What we're going to do now is we're going to get one person on either side in the audience to just explain why they changed their opinion and what got them to that point. So I think we'll just start with UChicago because I'm looking at you guys right now. And if you would also like to come move up closer to the mic, if you're brave enough, you don't have to be in front of the camera, but if you're brave enough to come close enough to speak to the mic, that would be great. Would anyone like to volunteer themselves? Okay, we have one volunteer on this side. Introduce your name as well and tell us why you changed and what you changed to and from.
Hi, my name is Jimmy. In my previous answer to does AI will have consciousness, I previously said yes, and then now I changed to no because I think I had confusion between whether by AI we mean something like a current AI product like ChatGPT, or AI purely in virtue of implementing the program in this like the purely serial sense. That is to say, there's a possible argument that what we have right now, like that we kind of equate to AI, things like ChatGPT, might already have something in addition to the purely kind of functionalistic or program implementation than it's intended in serial sense. So I was thinking more about that in the first discussion, but then in the second sense, I think I would agree more that pure AI purely in virtue of implementing program is not sufficient for consciousness. That's why I changed my decision. Yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy.
We lost Jimmy.
If someone from USC would like to also share why they changed their opinion.
Would anyone be brave enough to come to the camera, or if you want to sit in your seat or talking, that's also okay. Does anyone change their opinion? No one changed their opinion during this entire.
So,
Jimmy is.
Yes. Oh, there's actually one person. Do you want to?
Yeah, he's gonna come on down. Come on down.
Wow. Okay, let's give a round of applause for this.
Originally, I believed that consciousness exists. Professor Kaplan changed my mind. Originally, I believed that consciousness exists, or sorry, free will exists. But Professor Kaplan changed my mind. I think the example about there being two identical universes, and then you said that every single atom is the same in each universe. Why would you choose different things in each universe? I think that kind of made a lot of sense to me, where it's like, if every single factor is the same, I don't see like why there'd be any reason to change your opinion. And it's kind of like that same vein of reasoning where all choices are deterministic, and that's kind of like what my opinion is now. So yeah.
Great.
Okay, I think we're just going to close out the event because it was wonderful to hear from both professors. It was wonderful to hear from you guys. One more round of applause for everyone.
Let's appreciate both professors for joining us. It is so very nice to have you guys. We also didn't plan for this to happen, but somehow we just end up having neuroscience against philosophy, I guess. There is some nature in the two branches that disagree with each other, but it's very nice to have you guys, especially very nice. Thank you all so much, especially to Jacinia. Thank you guys
so much. So much fun.
Right.